Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Loss, which is episode 10 of Season 4 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the 4th season episode, The Loss. So The Loss is the episode in which the Enterprise is stuck in a strange phenomenon where they're being carried away by two-dimensional beings, and as a side effect, Troy loses her empathic powers and she struggles with this, resigns until Picard begs her help because the Enterprise is about to be destroyed by a quantum or a cosmic string, but Troy figures out that the two-dimensional beings are actually purposely trying to go into the string, so they find a way to imitate another string to get them to move briefly, which allows the Enterprise to escape. And as soon as the Enterprise does, Troy regains her powers and she apologizes to Beverly, who she was being very mean to throughout the episode. So this is number 23 in my top 25 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. I did a video for a couple years ago, 4 years ago. I did top 10 worst videos of this Star Trek franchise, and I did a video review for every episode in my top 10. I decided to expand that and do my top 25. However, many of the episodes on that list I had already done reviews for, so I decided to just make one video which covers my number 25 through 11. I will link that in the description below. However, for the episode reviews that I haven't done yet, I will mention that this is part of my top 25. The episodes that I have already done the videos for, I'm actually changing the thumbnail and the title to say that's in my top 25, but the bulk of the video won't represent it because I made it before I decided officially that it was in my top 25 worst episodes. So these are might be more appropriate to say least favorite. These are my least favorite episodes, or at least the episodes that I think are the worst of the franchise. This makes it to number 23, so it makes my top 25, but it's not towards the top of the list. So that tells you right there what I think of this episode. So this was a part of one of season 4 of one of the episodes that I saw repeatedly. In fact, I have a very distinct memory of, because I have a feeling that they didn't necessarily show the orders in the episodes in chronological order, that they were jumping all over the place, because I had a concept of seasons. Like, I knew that I didn't really know what was season 1, 2, 3, or 4, but I knew that earlier seasons had Tasha Yar, and other, earlier seasons had Pulaski, but I didn't really distinguish between season 3 and 4. And I, have said repeatedly in my reviews that it took me a while before I saw season 3, but I don't think it's true for all of season 3. I think I might have saw scattering of episodes from season 3 early on. Like, I remember seeing Who Watches the Watchers fairly early on, but it would be a very long time before I saw Yesterday's Enterprise or The Offspring. So maybe we just missed some of the episodes in season 3. I don't know. And Deja Q, I remember it took a long time before I saw that. But either way, I was more familiar with season 4. I saw those episodes. They definitely showed them more often. And I have a very distinct memory of tuning in to syndication 1 because I knew there were still a bunch of episodes out there that I heard of, like Yesterday's Enterprise and Deja Q, that I really wanted to see. But instead, this was playing for like the 5th time. Not just like I've watched it 5 times after I recorded in VHS. No, it showed up on syndication 5 times. Now, granted, this is between 2 channels because I lived between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., so we got both those channels, and so there was one Washington channel, one Baltimore channel that would play Star Trek syndication, but they were both, like, repeating season 4 repeatedly. And I remember, like, my brother, who was not Alyssa, I wouldn't misgender her like that. But we had another sibling. My brother was watching baseball, I think the Orioles, and I wanted to check Star Trek and see what it was playing, and I was like, oh no, never mind, it's just the loss. And he was like, well, I'm watching the loss too because the Orioles are going to lose. I don't know why I remember that joke, but I do. Anyway, so yeah, I hated this episode from the very beginning. I never liked this episode, and I think my sister agreed with me. We used to lambast this episode. It was probably the first episode, as I said, season 4 was the first season I saw, so it was probably the first episode that we truly hated. It would be a little while before I saw Code of Honor, if I remember correctly. But here's the thing. So I've heard some people praise this episode. Marina Sirtis even talked about how she had a lot of fans come up to her and praise this episode, in particular fans who were disabled, and said that they felt represented by this episode, and they felt like this they identified so much with Troy in this episode. And so I'm not disabled, but at the moment, I'm actually temporarily disabled, just like Troy was temporarily disabled in this episode. Not to get too personal, but 4 months ago, I had started having extreme back pain that was so extreme that I couldn't even walk. Like, if I was sleeping and I had to pee and I had to get up and go to the bathroom, I was like screaming in pain with every step. Every step was agonizing pain. And thankfully it was only that way for like a week or two, where it was that painful where I couldn't even walk. Like, I had to just, sit down. Unfortunately, I didn't have a wheelchair, so I couldn't really go anywhere, and I just had to like muddle through and scream in pain when I actually needed to use the bathroom or something. But as I said, that only lasted for like a week or two, but still in the past 4 months, I still can't stand or walk more than like 20 or 30 minutes without the pain starting up again, without getting into extreme agonizing pain. And on top of that, I've been having heart issues where I'm like can barely breathe, and I'm very dizzy sometimes. Sometimes I can't even get out of bed because my breathing is so shallow combined with my back problems. So I have been temporarily disabled. And that's not to say that I'm not comparing that to people who have more serious or more permanent disabilities, but I am comparing it to this episode because this episode is also about someone who is temporarily disabled. Now, I realize that everyone handles disabilities or handles any pain or difficulties differently. So I will acknowledge that up the top. But I can't imagine reacting to people the way that Troy reacted to people in this episode. I completely didn't. Now, to be fair, the moments I was in the most pain, I did get agitated. I did snap at people a bit more than I would normally do, but not to the degree that Troy did. And also, I couldn't imagine yelling at people for showing sympathy. Like, that's not what people showed sympathy to me. I didn't, or tried to sort of make me feel better, which is what people do to Troy, and she loses her shit and yells at them for it. I couldn't imagine doing that. The thing that pissed me off when I was going through the worst of it was people who didn't acknowledge my disability, who are like, oh, you should clean that up, or you should do this and do that. I'm like, don't you realize how painful it is to me to do that? So that would piss me off when people would try to make me do things that would cause me pain. So that doesn't really apply to Troy. I couldn't imagine someone coming up and showing sympathy and trying to be like, don't worry, it's only temporary, your back pain's I'm sorry about that, and if you work through it, you can improve. I couldn't imagine yelling at someone for saying that. I would be very grateful for someone to say that. But as I said, That's just me. I realize there might be some people out there who can, and apparently Marita Sarah said, who identify more with Troy and identify with the frustration of people showing too much pity or whatnot. And maybe I was just not around those kinds of people, and maybe that's why it didn't bother me. But it's hard for me to imagine reacting to a disability the way that Troy reacted. Now, that's not the reason why I think this episode fails, though. The reason, because I acknowledge that there are some people who would behave this way, and that's perfectly valid. But the episode fails because the analogy fails. Because in this instant, they're not portraying someone who loses an ability. They're portraying someone who loses a privilege. And there's a difference. Now, stay with me here. And this is why I think it's a terrible analogy to people who actually have disabilities, permanent or otherwise. So Rick Berman, I'll do a quote from Rick Berman, and you know how much I disagree with him frequently. But anyway, Rick Berman says, "I pushed for this episode a lot. It was fascinating to me that someone would lose one of their senses and be unable to explain it to others because they didn't have it in the first place. If you were the only sighted person in a colony of blind people and suddenly you lost your vision and they all said, 'So what?' That's what this was." So here's the thing. It's funny because I just read this quote like a couple minutes ago before I came on to do this. But I was already planning on making the analogy to a planet of blind people, and there's one sighted person, and that sighted person loses their sight. I was planning on making that analogy, so I think it's kind of ironic that Rick Berman had already made that analogy. But the thing is, in that instance, if we have a planet full of blind people and there's someone who has a sight but they go blind, and then they react the same way Troy is, where they're yelling at him, completely tearing them apart. Anyone showing sympathy, she'll like rip to shreds and be like, "How dare you, blah blah, fuck you," and whatever bitchy things that Troy was doing throughout this episode. Yeah, I said the word bitchy, and I'm going to say it because she was being a bitch. I'm not afraid to say that. But anyway, if someone who lost their sight in a planet full of blind people, like everyone else is blind, and they started like being rude to everyone, the blind people would be like, "Fuck you! Like, you're bitching about being blind. We've been blind our whole lives, and we're perfectly fine." Like, they would have created an entire society and they would have adapted and learned to live without their sight. And like, you had this privilege that we didn't have, and now you expect us to have sympathy because you lost that privilege. And that's the difference. Like, if Troy was on Beta Z, surrounded by telepaths, and she lost her empathic abilities, that would be a different thing. I think it makes a difference that she's the only one with this special ability, this privilege that no one else had, and then loses it. So another very apt analogy I would make to this, and I did this before in other videos, I think my season by season review, it's like someone who's super rich, who has all this privilege, and they have all these luxuries, and they grew up their whole lives with these luxuries and being completely wealthy, and then one day something happens, they go bankrupt, they lose all their wealth, and they have to live in poverty, and then complaining and bitching and moaning to all the other people who have been poor their whole lives, and those poor people probably wouldn't take very kindly to it. Like, some might be understanding or try to be understanding. "Oh, it sucks. It does suck to lose all that money and the privilege that you're used to." But if the response would be like totally bitchy to everyone, eventually they would be like, "Fuck you. You've had this special privilege that we didn't have. We had to live like this our entire lives. We got by just fine, and you're being a bitch because you don't have this privilege that we never had." And that's essentially what Troy is doing in this episode. She had this special power, this special ability that made her so much better than everyone. And I mean, that's when the writers actually wrote it correctly. And for sometimes they're acting like she didn't have that power, or her powers was kind of useless. But she always had this edge. Quoting Devonali Rawl from the episode The Price, which, by the way, I heard someone say was a much worse episode than this. They're wrong. This episode's way worse than The Price. But anyway, quoting Devonali Rawl, yeah, this that's an edge that she has. Like, and so the episode fails. The episode is very hard. It's one of the most annoying episodes to watch because you see Troy just treating everyone like shit. She treats Beverly like shit. She treats Riker like shit. She treats Picard like shit. Like, there's this scene where she goes in to resign, and Picard, like, tries to very diplomatically, because Picard's always diplomatic, very carefully be like, look, you know, you can work through this. You don't need to resign. And then he starts to tell, like, a great Picard story. Like, Picard has the best stories, the best speeches, and he starts to talk about someone who was disabled at the Starfleet Academy, and Troy interrupts him and says, I can't remember her exact quote, but something's along the lines, spare me your stupid inspirational anecdote. This is happening, so just shut up. No. I'm sorry. Like, when that happened, I lost my shit. I don't care what the fuck condition you're in. I don't care how bad you have it. I don't care how much pain you're in. You don't fucking do that to Picard. No fucking way. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, I completely lost any sympathy I've ever had for this character, ever, and especially in this episode. Like, my sympathy was gone. It was drained after that scene. You don't fucking treat Picard like that. I don't care what the fuck you're going through. You could be dying. You don't fucking do that to Picard. I'm sorry, but you just fucking don't. Picard has the best speeches, and he's definitely coming from a place of well-meaning. Like, he wants to do, you know, to be, you know, generous to her, and is really well-meaning and is trying to help her. And the fact that she shuts him up and yells at him when he tries to give a great inspirational speech, that is unacceptable in my eyes. And to be clear, that's not the only scene that pissed me off. The way she was reacting to Beverly, who was just trying to be kind to her and trying to be like, look, you can work through this. And she loses her shit and starts yelling at her for treating skinned elbows instead of going to her because she had a fucking headache. And I think there's some Patreon comments that point this out. The fact that Beverly probably was treating some serious injuries. Like, there's might be some people who, like, would have died. You know, it's triage. Troy called and said, oh, I got a headache. That's not going to be a priority in triage. And so for Troy to yell at her for that, I'm sorry, it's really unacceptable. And that's why this episode fails. Because Rick Berman's concept makes sense when he said, oh, that's interesting that, you know, she loses a sense that no one else has. But they don't play it like that. They have her turn into the biggest bitch imaginable, which is not fitting, as I said, for someone who has a privilege, loses a privilege that no one else has, so that is brought down to the same level as everyone else around them. That is not how they should behave. I'm sorry. As I said, on that planet of blind people, if some sighted person, the only sighted person lost their sight, they would not behave like that. Otherwise, they would get creamed. They would get yelled at. No one would have sympathy for them. And also someone who, was super rich and was whining about being poor because they lost all their money. Like, the poor people would not have sympathy for them because they had to live like that their whole lives. And here's my other major point. and I said this on my season by season review as well. I compared it to the movie Spider-Man: Homecoming, when Spider-Man, does these things and he goes against Tony Stark's wishes and lies to him about trying to hunt down these the bad guys. And Tony Stark responds by taking his suit away from him. So he gave him this awesome Spider-Man suit, if you never saw the movie, that had all these special abilities, and it was like almost like an Iron Man suit, but it was like it had this AI that would talk to him, and it have all these like really cool things. And so Iron Man took that suit away from him, which is a big deal. And Peter Parker said to Iron Man, "I'm nothing without the suit." And Iron Man's response was, "If you're nothing without the suit, then you don't deserve the suit." And that's the exact same thing I'd say to Counselor Troy. When she says, "I can't do my job. I can't be a ship's counselor without my empathic abilities," then I would paraphrase Iron Man and say, if you can't do your job without your empathic abilities, then you don't deserve that job. That is flat out harsh realities, but it's flat out true. The way that she reacts. Now, the one scene that's okay is when she's talking to Guinan, because for some reason she decides not to be complete and total bitch to Guinan, where she's a complete and total bitch to everyone else, but decides not to be that way to Guinan for some odd reason. And Guinan kind of, it's funny, it's really ironic though, because Guinan's whole reverse psychology thing was, oh, I'm going to be the ship's counselor, and Troy's like, no, there's a lot more to being a ship's counselor. And she gets Troy to see that she has other abilities to rely on. But the irony of that scene is that Guinan kind of proved that she would be a better ship's counselor than Troy in that moment. I mean, this is something that people have been saying over and over again, that Guinan would make a better ship's counselor than Counselor Troy. And I don't know if I always agree with that, but it's definitely the case in this episode. Ironically, when the point is supposed to be that Guinan could never do the job better than Troy, when she's proven that she could. And then you have, so the other good scene that was a kind of relief in this episode is when Riker fucking yells at Troy. That was so cathartic. That was so like, thank God someone's finally putting her in her place and finally giving her the tough love, because Riker does care about her, and he does generally want to help, and he tries everything to try to be helpful, but she just beats him up and slaps him down for trying to be helpful. And again, I could never imagine doing that to people around me. I just couldn't. But anyway, he slaps her down and oh no, she slaps him down, treats him like shit, and finally got sick of it. And what he said was still coming from a place of love, but he realized that she needed some tough love. And I agree. I totally see that he did the right thing and behaved correctly by putting her in her place and being like, look, you had this privilege that no one else had, and you lost it. And that seems, there's something really aristocratic about that, and that's a beautiful word. Like, I love that scene. I love the fact that he said that. It's one of the reliefs moments in this episode. But yeah, then we also had this stuff with the patient that Troy was seeing, which I totally never put two and two together until someone just pointed this out to me. This is the same actress who played Picard's wife in the Nexus in Star Trek Generations. And once I never made that connection, but as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Well, she barely appeared in that movie, to be fair. But she's a terrible actress in this episode. I'm sorry. Like, I really don't buy it. And I think these scenes are written poorly too. They're a bit like, being a counselor is a lot more complicated, and therapy is a lot more complicated than how they're portraying it in this episode. And they do it for plot's sake to show, like, at first Troy thinks that, oh, I suck as a counselor because I'm reading her wrong without my abilities, and then she comes back and it's like, no, you were right about me the whole time. You shouldn't quit. Like, that was so contrived. It was so terrible. It was so bad. Anyway, so there's a B plot, and I talked about this in the previous episode, how from here on out, like starting with last week's episode, Final Mission, the season 4 and 5, and then Voyager as well. And I think there's a couple in season 6 or 7, I'll have to see. But they'll rely on this terrible format that I hate, where they'll do a boring A story that's a character story, and the B plot's this throwaway thread of the week sci-fi bullshit nonsense that nobody gives a fuck about. But the difference here is I actually find the throwaway B plot more interesting because the A plot is so terrible. Like, to be fair, some of the A plots in these character stories are at least halfway decent, and some of them might be actually good. But this one was just so bad, where it's a throwaway B-plot nonsense bullshit that usually I would not care about. Like, two-dimensional beings are, struggling the Enterprise and it's dragging it into the freaking cosmic stream. Oh, no. But every time they went back to it, I'm like, oh, thank God. Thank God they're going back to this. Don't have to deal with Troy's bullshit anymore. And this is something someone pointed out to me in a review. I didn't notice this myself, but it's such a great point. Is that the scene where Troy works with Data towards the end to try to come up with the solution to save the ship. They should have pointed out that Troy could never read Data, and therefore interacting with him should appear normal. And so she should function. She should have, and maybe they demonstrated this, but I think they should have pointed this out. I think they should have made it clear that, oh wow, like, this is actually not so bad because I could never read you anyway. But the episode's really not written well. It's really not. And then when they, even though at the start of the episode they said she had brain damage, and then as soon as the Enterprise leaves the two-dimensional beings, she's miraculously fixed. So her brain damage was fixed by that. I don't know. They said later, it was the overwhelm. I was overwhelmed by the intensity of the emotions coming from the two, and it short-circuited my empathic abilities. So that caused brain damage? I don't know. That seemed like a BS nonsense to me. It's just an excuse to have this very bad plot. So, yeah. And at least she apologized to Beverly. Like, at least she did that. She didn't fucking apologize to Picard for interrupting his awesome speech, so that pissed me off. But at least she apologized to Beverly, but she didn't really apologize to Riker. Just because Riker fought back with some tough love, he doesn't deserve an apology. The fuck he doesn't. He deserves it just as much as anyone else. But yeah, that wasn't good enough. That ending was not good enough at all to justify her behavior in this episode, or how annoying this goddamn episode was to watch, and just how poorly written it was. It was just a terrible episode in every sense. So that is why it makes my top 25 worst episodes of Star Trek. Anyway, I'd like to thank all my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It is very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel. So I want to give a shout out First of all, I want to give a very special thanks to Brandon Neal Howells for his support. Thank you so much. Very helpful for your mega support. So also give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joe Lavals, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "The loss, more like..." Actually, that name is suitable. "This episode was a total loss. Nothing to salvage." Couldn't agree more. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, "This episode totally deserves to be on the top tier worst list of TNG. To me, Troy in this episode is so annoying and irritating. You don't feel sorry for her because she treats the whole crew and Dr. Crusher in particular like shit, and it was so awful. This episode does a piss poor job and regarding disability, and I think this is even worse than the second season episode of DS9. Speaking of this one, of the A plot / B plot, where you have a character story and anomaly BS that no one cares about, so this is in my top 5 worst list, as many other people. So my rating is, of course, a 1 out of 10. I think it is worse than that DS9 second season episode, but I think both episodes are very bad at treating disabilities. There was some good episodes that actually handled disabilities well, that I already covered in TNG. I think Loud as a Whisper was one of them, and I think there was another one. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was Tin Man. Yeah, I thought that Tin Man handled it fairly well. Definitely a lot better than this episode did. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, "First of all, this episode is awful, and second, I have to apologize to a character named William Riker, as I was going to have a massive rant about him, but I forgot about a scene in that episode that shows me how bad this crapalog episode is, as I forgot about one of 3 good scenes in the whole episode. So my comment has to change for what I was originally going to write. Deanna Troi contacts Beverly because she thinks she is having a headache. Beverly is busy and she will come as soon as possible, as she's receiving calls from all over the ship. Fast forward to sickbay, and Deanna doesn't like the advice Beverly gives her about trying to adjust because she lost her superpower, and then she goes to attack mode because Beverly responded to other calls first. What if Beverly went to Troy first and someone died from their injuries because Beverly wasn't there to help them? How would you feel about that, you ungrateful bitch with a capital B? Or is that witch with a capital B? When Deanna realized she lost her superpower and tells Picard she can't do her job and runs off like a spoiled little brat, Riker goes to her as he would, being the only one on the Enterprise who knows more about Deanna than anyone else, and you basically tell him to feck off. What if Data said this to Deanna? I wish I could feel what it was like to lose my daughter, Lal. So I understand what it is like losing something that other people don't have, instead of Troy understanding what Data is saying. Troy says this, it's not the same, and you have no idea what it's like to lose something you never or may never have, emotions. And by the way, your daughter died last year, so get over it, you dumb android. Yeah, now that would have just pissed me off even more. Jesus Christ. Anyway, so now we get to the best part of the episode, when Riker tells Deanna some harsh truths about losing her superpower. Originally, I was going to rant about Riker being an insensitive asshole, but he was 100% right, because Deanna is being an Earth. And one last thing, she is a fecking counselor. Picard should have thrown her out of the nearest airlock, sorry, wrong show, for bitching about his inspirational speech he was giving. Maybe she doesn't like the fact that Patrick Stewart is from Yorkshire. Guinan to the rescue with some useful reverse psychology. And suddenly, Deanna Troi realizes she doesn't need her superpower because counselors rely on instinct. Hence, with experience, like any other job. How do you think the FBI were able to profile serial killers by interviewing them? Damn, I love that show Mindhunter. I have been waiting 20 years for a show like that since I've read the book Mindhunter. I saw something online that season 3 may happen. Knowing my luck, it won't. Deanna helped Ensign Janet Brooks, and again trying to find a solution with Data, but who cares? The damage of this episode speaks for itself. So my rating is 2. Oh yeah, remember that final mission episode when Troy tries to be there for Beverly because Wesley is missing? This is what really happened when the director said cut. Beverly says to Deanna, you have no idea what you're talking about because you never had a child, so you possibly can't relate how I'm feeling, so feck off and leave my sickbay or I'll report you for being an Urs out of 10. You're having a whole paragraph out of 10 now. You're just really stretching it. But, of course, I totally agree. Completely 100% agree with the sentiments. And I like how you call this superpower. That is very apt. It gets to my point about it being a privilege and how whiny she sounds for losing a superpower that no one else ever had. And privilege. How she sounds very privileged. Check your privilege, Deanna. Sorry, but not sorry. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, the topic of disability is relevant, but the implementation is not very successful. Awful was the first scene with the miraculous improvement of the condition of Troy's patient. Deanna and Beverly never had any good chemistry and certainly don't have it here. The scenes with Riker are quite decent, but his attempt to kiss her at the end felt inappropriate in this situation. The solution was rushed and comes out of nowhere. My rating is a 2 out of 10. Yeah, I don't know if I agree about the solution being rushed. Yeah, it seemed to make sense to me. Yeah. Deanna and Beverly having no chemistry is also something I'm not sure I agree with. I can't recall at the moment, but I'm pretty sure there's at least one episode where they have decent chemistry. But it ain't this one. That's for damn sure. So next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, this Ada metaphor fails spectacularly and Troy's reactions make watching this episode unbearable. Guinan gives the kick she needed, but otherwise Riker is so right in Troy acting aristocratic. He could have been more blunt and said even worse than her mother when she states her titles. 1 two-dimensional plot point to character assassination out of 10. I at first didn't understand what ADA meant, but someone explained to me it was the Americans Disability Act, which is what I think you're going for as a metaphor, because that makes sense, the disability metaphor. Wasn't familiar with that term myself. But you're totally right that Riker was completely right in saying that Troy was aristocratic. In fact, I've heard other people, like other reviews I watched, say that Riker was being a dick. I'm like, no. If anything, Riker is being too nice to her. Because he gives her tough love, but he's coming from a place of love. And you understand it's coming from a place of love. But really, he could have been way, way worse. If someone wanted to be a dick to her, they could have done way worse than what just calling her aristocratic. He was just giving her tough truths. If they wanted to be an asshole to her, they could have, and frankly, the way she was behaving, she would have totally deserved it, as she's coming off as a spoiled, privileged brat. But anyway. So, final comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, "The dead loss. I hate this episode. Deanna Troi is a whiny little bitch. Picard is a patronizing prick. What difference does it make whether Deanna loses her powers or not? Because 1, 3/4 of the time her empathic readings are unclear. 2, we know she's going to get them back by the end of the episode anyway. Vote 1, Guinan for ship's counselor. 2 cosmic strings out of 10. Actually, the original plan, or at least they briefly considered not giving her powers back, and there's some people who think that they should have done that because they never use her powers properly. And I disagree with that. I'm actually glad they didn't make this permanent. Because I wouldn't want to see her be like this for the rest of the show. But even if she wasn't, let's say she went back to accepting her life without her powers, I think because this would seem like it cheats to try to solve the issue of the fact that they never use her powers properly. And I think that the better solution to that problem is to use her fucking powers properly. Now, part of the reason why they never do, or sometimes don't, because they sometimes do, and I mentioned it, I remember always pointed out, oh, great, they're using Troy's empathic powers. Isn't this great? Because I had to point it out because they usually don't. But when they do, I'm like, wow. But part of the reason why they didn't is it interfered with the plot. It was, some people refer to it as a plot buster, where she could resolve the plot too easily. In fact, this will come up next week in the very next episode, Data's Day, where there's a Romulan spy on board posing as a Vulcan ambassador, and they were shocked to learn this, but why the fuck did her empathic abilities nonsense? In fact, her empathic abilities should have easily been able to tell the difference between a Vulcan and a Romulan, because Vulcans are a lot more emotional and you know, don't have the years and years of Vulcan logic restraint that Vulcans do. So she should have instantly been able to tell that this was an imposter. So I can kind of see why some people wanted her to lose her abilities permanently, but I think, and there's some future episodes where her being empathic is used in very good, subtle ways. In particular, was the episode Face of the Enemy that I'm thinking of, which I praised because they never stated she was using her empath abilities, but you can tell. Well, actually, they did in one scene. One scene she specifically said, oh, this guy is lying. But you could tell that her empathic abilities were helping her to navigate posing as a Tal Shiar operative. And I thought that was brilliant. And I think there's a few other episodes going forward where they do justice to her empathic abilities. But there are other episodes, like the very next one, where they go right back to ignoring them, where they should have actually solved the problem. So, yeah, I think the solution is to write her better, not to just because I think she's already a useless character, and if you take away her empathic ability, she becomes even more of a useless character. And I think by that stage, you might as well just write her off the show, because I think it would be kind of pointless having her around without those empathic abilities. But Brandon makes a good point about how she constantly says, oh, I just can't get a read. Oh, Legacy is another example where someone was deceiving them that she should have known. She's like, oh, I just can't read. I can't get a clear read on this. And they always say that when the plot requires her not to know it. But anyway, it's just better writing is what's required, you know, whether you keep her empathic abilities or not. And I think they will have mixed results in the future when it comes to better writing. As I said, sometimes they use it better, sometimes they do the same old shit and have her powers not work for the plot contrivance. So it could go either way. But either way, I'm glad that they did have her get her powers back by the end of the episode. Let's see. Oh yeah, and I disagree that Picard was a patronizing prick. I think Picard is always awesome, and he was going to give an awesome speech, and she was being a bitch by shutting him down before he could give his awesome speech. So that's unacceptable, in my opinion. Anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for The Lost out of 10 is a 1, the worst. Now, I know some of my Patreon supporters gave it a 2, and that's fair if that's how they feel. But for me personally, the bad of this episode is so bad it overrides any of the good. Like, the B plot is not that good. It is just seems like it's good in comparison to how terrible the A plot is, and that does not get it off the hook from being a 1, in my opinion. The A plot is just written so poorly, performed so poorly, and more to the point, it's very annoying to watch. This is one of the episodes, it's not like an episode like The Fight or Sub Rosa where I kind of enjoy watching it, even though they're worst episodes. They're much higher on my on my top 25 worst list. They're my number, yeah, they're in my top 3, I think. But even though I think those episodes are worse objectively, they're not as difficult to watch as this episode. This episode is just an episode I never want to watch because it's just painful. It's just annoying. It's like nails in the chalkboard, and I don't think it's written well because it doesn't do the real issue of having a disability justice, because it's not a good analogy. They fuck up the analogy, kind of like Tuvix does. Where they do a terrible job where instead of trying to show what it's like to have a disability, they show what it's like for someone who has privilege to lose that privilege and whine about it to others who don't have the privilege. So, yeah, I totally agree with all the sour sentiments towards Troy. I think she absolutely deserves it in this episode. And god damn it, you don't interrupt Picard when he's giving an awesome speech. You just don't. That's just one of the things in life that you never ever do. Can't believe that. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Lost. Number 23 in my top 25 worst episodes of the entire franchise. Yeah, and if you want to see more of my top 25 worst, you can check out the link in the description below. So, coming up next on my channel, let's see, next will be my review for Data's Day on Wednesday. Thursday, we'll cover the first 2 episodes of Discovery that's coming out. And then on Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon for revisiting my review for The Wounded. And then next Monday I'll be back here on my channel for another video essay, this time exploring the myth of franchise fatigue and why it's dangerous. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out for those videos and many more Star Trek videos and many more videos and many other shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.